My name is Dr. Jonathan Lightfoot. I'm the director of the Hofstra Center for Race, Culture, and Social Justice. I, along with our associate director, Dr. Veronica Lippincott, welcome you to today's Center for Race, Culture, and Social Justice's first signature event for the fall 2023 semester, a public lecture featuring the winning recipient of our 2023 Faculty Summer Research Grant, Professor Russell Chun, who is an associate professor in the Department of Journalism, Media Studies, and Public Relations here at Hofstra. The topic of his lecture is Pygmalion and Waifu. Did I pronounce that right?
Waifu.
Waifu. Okay, thank you. I wasn't sure about that. Exploring the racial and gendered practice of generative AI image making. Professor Chun was recently featured on WRHU Radio, where he was interviewed by the host for the morning show in anticipation of today's lecture. Cool. The Center's annual Faculty Summer Research Grants are aimed at supporting research, scholarship, and curriculum development that focuses on issues of race at the intersections of culture and social justice. Recipients of these grants are asked to deliver a public lecture the following year, either during the fall or spring semester, to share some of the results of their research. Please visit our website for more information and to review the call for 2024 proposals. Those faculty who want to be where he is right now, look out. So also, let me get my thing here. You're welcome to visit the center. Our physical location is in 203 Roosevelt Hall. One or more of our current student fellows will greet you and share with you some of the upcoming events planned for Hofstra community. I'd like to just acknowledge our student fellows, our graduate student fellows, Ashish Purakari, our undergraduate student fellows, Max Raymond, Sasha Ferdinand. Sasha's here, I saw you. Oh, cool, good. And Mariah Sukio. She's also our research assistant as undergraduate. So any of my students who are coming in, you need to sign a sheet if you want extra credit for this, if you did. All right, cool. She's holding up there. And if any other faculty wanted you to sign in, you should probably sign in, make a record of your presence today. Dr. Lippincott will now give our guest speaker a proper introduction. Thank you for coming, everyone.
Good afternoon. I'm Dr. Veronica Lippincott, Associate Director of our Center for Race, Culture, and Social Justice. It is our pleasure to introduce Russell Chun, Associate Professor in the Department of Journalism, Media Studies, and Public Relations at the Lawrence Herbert School of Communications, where he teaches multimedia storytelling, design, and data journalism. His research in visual communication has been published in Proceedings of the New York State Communications Association, Journal of Visual Literacy, Visual Studies, and Visual Communication Quarterly, where he serves as an associate director. He serves as associate editor, I should say. He is co-editor of the compendium Fake News, Real Issues in Modern Communication, chapter authored in Reimagining Communication, Mediation, and other books on Adobe software for Adobe Press. Without further ado, Professor Russell Chun.
Thank you. All right, thank you, everybody. Oops, sorry. Thank you for coming, and thank you to the Center for Race, Cultural, and Social Justice for the research grant that allowed me to pursue this line of inquiry. So let me just get started. Pygmalion and Waifu: Exploring the Racial and Gendered Practice of Generative AI Image Making. So let me start with a story. This is a story it's an ancient Greek myth of Pygmalion and Galatea. And the story is about how Pygmalion, he's a brilliant artist with consummate skill. He carves a statue of a beautiful woman and then falls in love with his own creation. The goddess Aphrodite transforms the statue to a real woman, fulfilling Pygmalion's desires. That's a common story. At one level, the story is about love. Right? They get married and they live happily ever after. It's actually one of the few Greek myths that end happily. But at another level, the story is about misogyny. The beginning of the story actually says that Pygmalion was disgusted at the behavior of the women around him. They were prostitutes. And that's what prompts him to create his statue. So it's about a man foisting his own expectations on what a woman should be. It's about the manipulation and the control of an image that's an object of desire. And so this is where I draw loose parallels to generative AI art. Generative AI allows anyone to have Pygmalion skill to create any image indistinguishable from reality, from mere text prompts. So how are these tools being used to visually represent women? That's my question. The last line of the poem I have here, his art concealed his art, that means that Pygmalion's incredible artistic skill hides the fact that it's art and not reality. And the same thing could be said for generative AI. The technology, the advanced technology, hides the fact that it's technology and not reality. And so this is how generative AI tools like Adobe Firefly, Stable Diffusion, Midjourney, DALL-E, these are all generative AI tools that do text to image. What you do is basically describe what you want. So that's the text prompt, Greek mythological sculptor, so on. And then it generates a novel image. And so this is what I did. This is in Midjourney 5.2. And it's remarkable because it's photorealistic, no editing, just straight out. And so, just in terms, these tools have been out only recently, but they've had a huge impact already, just in terms of the numbers and the scope and the scale. Just last fall, over 2 million images were created a day by users of DALL-E, with 1.5 million users. Currently, Midjourney, another tool, has about 14.5 million registered members. In July, Adobe Firefly claimed its service has already created 1 billion images. So we compare that to like popular stock commercial, photo houses, Getty Images and Shutterfly, they're about 350 to 450 million. So you can already see it has a huge impact just in terms of the sheer volume of content being created. So I come back to this question, right? Given the virtually unlimited power, this Pygmalion's power to create any image from mere text, what does the public create? And more specifically, to what extent are generative AI tools being used to reinforce or upend racial and gender stereotypes in visual communication? And so, are there any indications of racialized or gendered image making? Certainly there is. So anecdotally, if the joke around generative AI communities is that there are so much content that's hypersexualized, age compressed, and mangafied. And so I say mangafied because it's a very popular style. So manga is a Japanese comic book, and anime is a Japanese cartoon. And so it's hypersexualized in a male, heteronormative gaze. Age compressed, meaning there's an adultification of younger characters and a youthification of older characters. So it's a very narrow range of ages. And so, this tweet that I saw kind of perfectly encapsulates this trend. And it says, what the Mona Lisa would look like today, according to AI. So, we have Mona Lisa and she has, hypersexualized, she's, age compressed, and she has this stylization, this manga stylization. We're also seeing a lot more AI influencers and AI avatars. So these are some accounts from Twitter and Instagram. And you can see on the left, it says AI model and waifu. So waifu is a Japanese word for wife. And they use it to refer to anime cartoons or manga comic book characters that are objects of desire. And they, somebody wants them to be their wife. So it's waifu. So they explicitly say, hey, I'm an AI model and waifu. And so, these accounts make no bones about being wholly AI. And yet, or maybe because of that, they've garnered quite a substantial following. So, on the other hand, this tweet or this post caught my eye because it represents what else might be happening, right? And this person says, I love how we can make this technology create our own original stories and images. So there's like a subversion of the stereotypical images in popular culture. So, that's a possibility. So, what I want to do was let's make a content analysis of AI images to see what the case might be. So what was my approach? I'll preface this by saying I'm not a scholar of race studies or gender studies. So I'm approaching this from a visual perspective, visual communication perspective. But that said, I still wanted to anchor my study in established theories and concepts. So I turned to Erving Goffman's concept of gender display. In his book, Gender Advertisements in 1979, he's a sociologist. He's probably more known for his work on the presentation of self in everyday life. But in this book, he uncovers the visual ways popular media constructs masculinity and femininity. And so what he did was he described or he categorized gender displays in these 6 categories. And I'll go through them very quickly. These are all the original photos that he used in his book. So he first said relative size. So men were more frequently, generally presented as taller, higher on the frame, bigger than women. Function ranking. He said that men were often portrayed in more executive roles and women were more in the submissive assistant roles like this doctor and the nurses. But it wasn't just occupational, but it was also in domestic settings and other settings. In terms of family, he noticed that fathers were with sons, mothers were with daughters, and so there was a gender split in the family settings. Feminine touch was a category that included caress. So he said that women, more often than not, would be like lightly touching or barely touching objects. Men would firmly grasp them. And women would also be seen like touching their hair, touching their face, touching their clothes or bodies. And he called that self-touch. And that kind of, to him, that suggested a sense of preciousness or delicacy. Ritualization of subordination was an umbrella. It kind of encompassed a lot of different behaviors. One was low posture, so women were more frequently seen sitting or lying down. He described this canting behavior. So if your head or your body was on a tilt, that was canting. Or there is an imbalance of your posture. And he called this imbalanced posture a bashful knee bend. And we can see this, you're like, oh yeah, a lot of people do this. So we don't know, what one does, or which came first, right? He also described puckish styling or body clowning, which that's a term he used for like a childlike unseriousness. Men would be holding women, women would be expansively smiling. Okay, so all of these behaviors were collectively about a subordination, and what he called the women were dependent on the benignness of the surrounds. Those were his words, dependent on the benignness of the surrounds, because they weren't ready to spring into action. And then the last category was license withdrawal. So women were seen kind of shielding themselves, hiding themselves, covering their faces, or anchored drift. So they were drifting from the scene. So they weren't looking directly at you. They were kind of looking off the screen or not participating directly in the action of the scene. They were distracted. So signs of distraction were like a finger-to-finger gesture or a finger-to-mouth gesture. And so, there was this overall sense of being withdrawn and not engaged. So those were Goffman's categories. That's the framework which I started on. Subsequent researchers, so Belknap and Leonard, they actually operationalized it. So they said, hey, you know what? We're going to take these ideas and do a content analysis of advertisements. And they found that the last three were really the ones that were pronounced: feminine touch, ritualization of subordination, and license withdrawal. And then Kang came along and said, you know what, I'm going to add body display. So that's how, revealing clothes or tight clothes. And further researchers have said, okay, we're going to add depersonalization. And there are others, but these are the ones that I focused on. So you might think, okay, so that was back in 1979. Certainly things have changed. Well, so more recent studies, 2004, 2010, they looked at like the whole decade's worth of images of women in popular media, in magazine ads. And they concluded, so Lindner in 2004 said, you know what? There are stereotypical images of women still, found in advertisements. 78% portrayed women stereotypically with regard to at least one of the coding categories, Goffman's coding categories. Mager and Hegelson said, okay, in 50 years, even though the sort of functional roles, the occupational roles of women have changed, so we're no longer seeing them as nurses or just as nurses and secretaries, there are still representations of subordination and sexual objectification via Goffman. All right, so, but these ideas are like, there's an idea that these are advertisers imposing these ideas upon us. Professor Jolly said this, that the discourse through and about objects, that's what he called advertisements, is at the present time a profoundly undemocratic discourse because it's controlled only by advertisers and media, right? But that's back in 1987. So now we have social media. There's a lot of content produced, not just by the media or advertisers. So I looked at, okay, what is the user-generated content? And is that reflective of some of these stereotypical gender displays? So this is one study I found where Doring asked, okay, how gender stereotypical are selfies? So they studied these gender display codes by Goffman with Instagram selfies, and they compared it to the magazine advertisements. And her conclusion was that Instagram selfies, they do reproduce the stereotypes, the gender stereotypes. And in fact, they do so to a larger extent than magazine ads. She used the codes defined by Goffman and Kang. So, kind of that's the constancy in this methodology. So that leads me to my first hypothesis when I was approaching this. So in terms of generative AI art, gender displays will reflect broader cultural representations. And I say that because, one, generative AI tools, we know they're trained on this broad image base. And that base contains gender displays. Number two, users will make active choices to post images. And those choices are informed by the gender displays we are accustomed to seeing. Right? So we're not immune to those. And I think in the third point, in fact, I think users may be prone to choosing images that show an even greater level of gender display. Because there's an attempt to push AI into the realm of realism, to say, hey, look how real this is. And so to convince the public that these images are real means adopting the gender normative codes identified by Goffman. So that's my thinking. So how does race figure into this? So I'm turning to two related theories, related concepts, gendered race theory and intersectional invisibility. And so gendered race theory posits that race has a gendered component to it. And so the theory argues that, when we think of blacks, we think of males. It's prototypically masculine. When we think of Asians, we think of females. When we think of a woman, we think of them as white. And hence, there's a famous Black feminist phrase, all the women are white and all blacks are male. And actually, Kimberly Crenshaw, who termed intersectionality in her legal treatise, that's how she started off. That's what she used. And so when an individual who belongs to multiple marginalized groups is flattened down to one group, and that they represent non-prototypical members of that group, they are rendered invisible. They're underrepresented. So when we think of Black women, it's not just that they are members of two marginalized groups, Blacks and women. It's that there are Black but not male, and there are women but not white. And so they are underrepresented. And this helps think about, this is helpful when we think about Asian men and Asian women. So Asian women belong to two marginalized groups, right? Asians and women. Asian men belong to only one marginalized group, Asians, but we're still men. But because Asians are prototypically feminine, Asian men are non-prototypical. So they are the ones that are rendered invisible. So that's the theory, the non-prototypicality of Asian men and Black women. So there is evidence for this. There's cognitive and there's cultural invisibility. So statements by Black women are actually less remembered than Black men. Statements by Asian men are less remembered than by Asian women. When people are presented images of gender ambiguous Blacks and Asians, more often than not, people will assume the Blacks are men and the Asians are women. And when people are told to write stories, okay, you're gonna write a story about an Asian character and a Black character. Most people will write the story, the Asian character is gonna be a woman and the Black character is gonna be a man. So those are examples of cognitive invisibility. Cultural invisibility is, we can see that in dating. So Black women and Asian men actually have the lowest perceived attraction. I think it's like 15% and 9% or 6%. Black men and Asian women are up at like 60%. And then researchers have found that there is media and cultural underrepresentation for those two groups, Black women and Asian men. So this leads me to my second hypothesis, in terms of AI art. According to gendered race theory, Asian and white female gender displays are going to be seen at a higher rate than Black female gender displays. So that's my setup. So the way I approached this was I'm taking Goffman's codes. So we have feminine touch, ritualization of subordination, and so on. Those are all my variables. License withdrawal and body display. And then we have depersonalization. Then I also coded for gender, male and female, and race, white, Black, Asian, and unknown. So what data did I use? Well, there is a public Facebook group called AI Art Universe. It's a huge group. It has over 500,000 members. It's very active, hundreds of posts a day, 10,000 posts a month. And so there's a lot of media being created. This is a Facebook group. It's public, so people want to choose these images and show it off, okay? And so what I did, these are some examples of the data set. What I did was I collected about 12,000 images, a week's worth of images. So from like midnight on Monday to like 11:59 p.m. Sunday. So I just collected all of these images, 12,423, randomized and selected every 15th image to get a data set of about 829. And then I coded for females. So my final sample size is about 221 females AI art. And you can see this goes on for quite a long time, for about 6 minutes. And so after I did the coding, I had an independent coder come and do about 10% of it, and that's the what's best practice, because you want to see if two independent coders are making the same decisions, right? So this is called intercoder reliability. And one of the measures of intercoder reliability is what's called Krippendorff's alpha. And if it falls below a certain threshold, then that variable is deemed unreliable. Like there could be too many disagreements between these two coders. So the ones in gray are the ones that were not reliable. And so I threw them out and I couldn't use them in my study. Okay. So these are the results. For the total 221 females, 160, so 60% were white, 19, almost 20% were Asian, 5% were black. So already there you see, there is a greater proportion of Asian females than black females. I looked at whether the females were in the presence of males or not. And this surprised me. You can see that almost 100%, 98% of the Asian females were alone, okay, by themselves. And that was a statistically significant finding, that Asians, more than blacks and whites, were seen by themselves and not with another man. And I'll get back to that, what I think that might mean. So for Goffman's gender display codes, how did that break out? Well, for feminine touch, ritualization of subordination, license withdrawal, body display, there were numbers all around the board, really. And after crunching the numbers, there was no relationship between race and gender display, okay? So I thought, all right, what if there was, can I take a look at the degree of gender display? Maybe, one particular race is showing greater displays. So I looked at whether they fell in one category, no, or two or more. And again, here, there was no relationship that I found. But so, if I take race out of it and I just look at gender, so for all females, 77.4% displayed at least one category of gender display, which actually turned out to be remarkably similar to what Lindner in 2004 found. She said actually 78% of magazine ads showed at least one gender display. So, this is kind of my sort of preliminary conclusions at this point. A majority, 77.4%, show at least one category of gender display. And that's consistent with levels in popular media. And that's per Lindner. The second point is Asian females were proportionally greater than black females. But I did not see a relationship between gender display and race. And then the third thing was that Asian females, proportionately more than whites and blacks, were shown without a male. Now, I haven't really thought through that much about it, but my gut instinct, even though there was no relationship between race and body display or gender display, is that if we take that Asian females are more sexualized, they're seen as more feminine, or at least they're prototypically feminine, then they're going to be shown without somebody else, because if you think about pinups, you just want to objectify or you just want to see that single person. And if you are accompanied by a male, then the image storytelling, the narrative is more about, it's a story, right? Instead of just, we're going to ogle this one person. That's kind of how I'm thinking about it now. But, I need to kind of look into that. So here are some of the issues that came up while I was doing this study. There's a lot of interesting things, and I'll just kind of highlight some of these. Is the racial coding. So, when you are looking at advertisements, it's pretty, not easy, but I guess it's relatively straightforward to say, well, this person is black, this person is white, or this person is Asian, because they're humans. When you're looking at AI art, there's a lot of robots and aliens, superheroes, and anime characters. And so, I can ask the question, and I had to answer this question: what is the race of an anime or a manga character? Is Sailor Moon, so Sailor Moon is this popular old, anime character, is Sailor Moon white? And well, we say, okay, like blonde hair, blue eyes. I came up, there was this discussion on Twitter where there was a challenge. They said, okay, let's take Sailor Moon and re-render her. And artists re-rendered her. And there's one artist that, redrew Sailor Moon with almond-shaped eyes. Okay, and you can see here, artist draws art. Americans, oh my God, thank you for making her look Asian. And then Asians, she what? So, it's interesting because in some corners they're saying, oh, the Japanese, they are drawing anime characters to look white because, they want to be like us, or that they want to look white. And so I think it's a nice reminder of why the Center of Race has quotations around race. Right? It's a culturally, it depends on the cultural context, right? And I'll throw these up here, which is important when we talk about thinking about race and how we visually see race, because that's what it's about. How can I visually identify somebody? When we say mangas don't look Japanese enough, they have round eyes. Why do they have big round eyes? That the representations of themselves are not correct. Or that they want to look white, that means we are imposing our own cultural frame. Race itself can be defined as a visual reading process. That is, a process through which a viewer privileges certain parts and dismisses others in order to create a coherent whole according to assumed and naturalized cultural norms. So, we see the blonde hair and the big eyes, like, oh, she's white. Because there's no markings that signify the otherness. Oh, they don't have almond eyes, right? So if we just see a generic stick figure, we're going to assume it's a white person because that's the sort of the neutral norm. So, it's very different. And so it makes this a little bit more complicated. In Midjourney, which is one of the generative AI tools, there's actually a Niji mode, which creates this stylized manga anime. It's a very popular, art aesthetic. And so it makes, the perception of race, I have to deal with it in this study. Is it the stylization that makes them look Asian, or are they not Asian? It's just the style. So, that's still kind of an unsettled issue. These are two images from the data set itself. Puckish styling was one of the categories, right? Body clowning, puckish styling. So women were seen more with like an unseriousness to them. And these are some images from the data set. And you can see, on the left, there is this woman with like cat ears. A lot of times there were bunny ears. You can see this woman holding an ice cream cone. Sometimes there are lollipops. And, those are kind of classic examples of like, oh, they're being childlike. But then there's like this gray zone, fairy wings, and maybe like, what is this? Angel wings. Is that being childlike and unserious, or is it, sometimes it's more like, well, they're a character, like a cosplay character. Like, are they playing with swords, or is this like a Darth Vader person? So, that was kind of a gray area in terms of coding. I think probably one of the reasons why puckish styling was an unreliable indicator. So I think the definition has to be a little bit more precise. Body display. So I used Kang's definition of body display, and this is what she had said. She said, well, okay, body display, we are going to mark it as a positive if that character, that person is wearing body-revealing clothes, which include miniskirts or evening gowns which expose cleavage, short shorts, see-through clothes, halter dress, bathing suits. Close-up shots where shoulders are bare are considered nudity. So if you look at that middle image, that's a close-up shot where shoulders are bare. That would be considered body display. I don't know about that, right? So it could be overly encompassing. The other issue is, like, say the one on the right, you see that woman, and she's kind of a robot, or she has armor on. A lot of times you have characters that are wearing armor, and do you consider armor that is body forming to be body revealing? So that decision has to be made. Depersonalization. So typically, previous researchers have defined depersonalization as, okay, when you hide your face, but your body is exposed. That's depersonalization, because that is suggestive of sexual objectification, right? We see your body, but we don't care about your personality. I actually was finding a lot of the opposites, where we see the face. So you see the face is rendered, but the body is not exactly hidden, but it's been transformed. Sometimes it's robotic. Sometimes it's, maybe, I don't know, like kind of, you can see here it's sort of dissolving, or you see wires. But I still think this is, at some level, depersonalization and objectification of the body. And so it's kind of a reversal of thinking. We need to kind of be able to incorporate that kind of thing in the study. So let me end by talking about, I guess maybe I should have said this at the front about why this is important. But why is it important that we assess if and how images that users generate and share reflect the normative racial and gender displays in our broader culture? Well, this is important for the School of Communication, for obvious reasons. That's where I teach. Because as storytellers, as we start using more visual and generative AI tools, we have to be aware of the subtle and not so subtle cues that we might be inadvertently incorporating into our media, reinforcing those that are already present. And more importantly, as the next generation of AI tools get trained on data sets that include AI output, I think we might find ourselves in sort of a positive feedback loop. And I think that the behavioral and postural cues will likely get more exaggerated as the push for realism, ironically, moves images to be more stylized and artificial and mannerist. Mannerist in a way like, the mannerism movement that followed the Renaissance. Goffman said himself, I'll return to Goffman, he said himself of advertisements, quote, "If anything, advertisers conventionalize our conventions, stylize what's already a stylization, make frivolous use of what is already something considerably cut off from contextual controls. Their hype is hyper-ritualization." Right? So our behaviors in our everyday world is a ritual, and then ads are really a hyper-ritualization of that. And so will AI art be a hyper-ritualization? It's yet another layer on this. So that's where I'll end. And I am happy to take questions or thoughts from anybody. Yeah, Brooklyn. Do you want to use the mic? I don't think. You can shout.
So you were talking about how race has engendered
white.
White, etc. What about the other races? Like, what are their prototypes? How does that? Oh God, sorry. Like, how does that factor into the whole AI thing?
Yeah, no, a good question. And honestly, I don't know. I mean, I'm not a race expert, and if it's previous researchers actually have tried to code for Latino, Latinx, and I think what happened was their coding scheme was so unreliable in terms of the Krippendorf's alpha that too many people couldn't decide, and so they're like, we can't code for those other races. But in terms of the gendered component, I actually don't know that much about what the prototypicality is for other races other than white, black, and Asian. So sorry about that.
Okay, and also the whole depersonalization thing. What exactly is that again?
So that's when we see images where the face is covered, the woman's face is covered, but their body is still on display, and so that's depersonalization. You no longer see them as a person because they don't have that face.
What does that make the images that you showed us when you were talking about depersonalization?
Oh, so what I was saying is, in many cases, in my data set, it was the opposite, where the face was actually visible, but the body was somehow transformed, not really obscured, but transformed. And so my thought is, in my work, I probably have to kind of take that into account.
Oh, and also one last thing. Could you perhaps re-explain the whole hyper-ritualization thing again?
Oh, so Goffman's idea is that advertisements were basically an exaggeration of the rituals we do in everyday life.
So basically it is them trying to seem cooler when in reality everything that they are trying to sell you is what is already existing?
I don't know about cooler, but it's an artificial layer. And we can't sort of just take it as, oh, this is how people behave.
Oh.
Okay?
Okay.
Thank you. Yeah.
I'm not going to use the mic on this thing. But you're talking about being specific to races other than black.
Yeah.
Black and Asian. I'm going to fail at telling you which program this was, AI program.
Oh.
I'm sorry.
Oh.
I didn't realize I stopped. So aside from what you identified as the AI perhaps inability to distinguish past black, white, Asian, I recently saw a demonstration, and I'm going to fail at telling you what the program was. But if you were very specific with this program and you said Latina female, and it would generate a brown-skinned, dark-haired female. Same thing, and you could be as specific as Egyptian, Italian, Jewish. It was all there, and it was interesting because it was a stereotypical image of that person. But if you just put the most beautiful woman in the world, it would be a white, female, blonde.
Right.
Almost every time.
Yeah.
So those stereotypes were very apparent in this program.
Yeah.
It got specific, but it was still stereotypical.
Right, right. Yeah, exactly. I think they're getting better. I remember doing some tests early on by saying, a beautiful woman. And yes, it would be, all white women, very, they all look the same. And you had to specify if you wanted something. And actually, I've been on forums where they say, oh, here's a tip, put diverse crowd, and it'll inject, people of color and women into your rendering. But I think it's getting better, and you do see a little bit more diversity. So I think they're tweaking the models. Let's see if there's, why don't we go here, and then Brooklyn, you can go.
Hi.
Well,
So I wanted to talk about the beauty standards that you with seeing manga is a Japanese art, but then being like, oh, but they're trying to make them look white. How do you see that with just in general Asian beauty standards and how they're transplanted into, I feel like Asian beauty standards are like coming into America. So how does that fit into this sexualization thing?
Are you saying like kind of the Western world is sort of adopting Asian beauty standards?
Yeah, like there's like a combination of, I feel like, Asian and white beauty standards that are now like coming through in AI as like this deracialized woman. Yeah.
I don't know. I think I'd have to think about that a little more. But that's a good point. I think I think it's a popularity of some of the manga and anime styles, and people are being exposed to a broader range of styles and a broader range of aesthetics. So, thank you.
There was a question.
Yeah.
So just based off your research as a whole, do you believe that there's an issue or that we need to start paying attention to subconscious and implicit biases when it comes to race and patriarchal content when it comes to AI?
Oh, yeah, of course. Yes, definitely.
All right.
So, I think there are two issues with this. And I think Professor Morsoff also talked about this. There's biases in the tool themselves, right? So the AI tool themselves, if you put in, I want a surgeon in the operating room, are you going to get a white male in the operating room? So that's the bias there. But there's also the bias that actually my project tackles, which is, what are the images that people are choosing to generate and selecting and publishing themselves, right? So those are two things that I think we have to keep track of. Yeah.
I'm backing back up. How do you think that's going to affect us in the long term? Seeing as how AI generation is becoming more pushed, especially for advertisements, how do you think that that's going to have an effect on us in the long run as consumers?
Well, I think it depends on how responsible the advertisers will be when using AI. I think recently one of the biggest pushbacks came, I think it was Levi's, that said they were going to use AI art for their models because they wanted to have more diversity in their advertisements. And they said, well, you know what? You shouldn't be using AI to inject more diversity into your advertisements. You should just use more diverse models, real human beings. And so, it depends on how ethical and how responsible and how thoughtful advertisers can incorporate AI into their work.
Okay,
I think that's for any technology, right?
one more.
Yeah.
So based off that, looking at where we're currently at with corporations and how AI is being used to advertise, do you think that it's going to be used ethically in the long run, or do you think it's going to be used as sort of a spotlight for actual replenishment of diversity?
I mean, unfortunately, I think economics is a huge factor into this. I mean, we're already seeing that in the Hollywood writers' strike and actors' strike. AI figures prominently in that. I don't know. I don't have a crystal ball, but
This is just subjective.
yeah. So, but it's a good thought, and we need to keep those things in mind. Brooklyn, did you have a question? I know you had your hand up, but then
It is
I want to come back.
kind of forming.
No.
I suppose I wanted to ask a slightly unrelated question, referring back to the whole ritualization of subordination thing. How exactly does the whole that whole posing thing for selfies that women are stereotyped to do? How is that going? What exactly?
What do you mean? What's the discussion? The researchers want to see whether content that we generate ourselves reproduce those stereotypical displays.
And would that exactly how does that affect generative AI? Like what they tend to create when you put in that sort of prompt?
Oh, well, it wasn't directly related to generative AI, but I used it as background information to make a point that, these aren't external forces that are pushing these stereotypes on us. And a lot of times we've incorporated them ourselves and we're reproducing them. So when we take selfies, when women take selfies, they're mimicking what they might be seeing in advertisers. And so I'm not sure what comes first, you know what I mean? But that's what the researchers are saying, is that user-generated content have the same levels as popular media.
Okay.
Professor Chun,
Mm-hmm.
thank you so much for this presentation. I brought my radio audio class to this presentation because I would like them to think about artificial intelligence in terms of audio and the kinds of gendered sexualization, etc., in terms of audio, thinking about what is the
No, I think that I haven't thought about that. My focus has been sort of on the visual, but I think it's a really interesting question. And I think it's one that's worthy of kind of pursuing because, to think what is it that makes a man's voice, and what is it makes a woman's voice, other than, the registry and the tone. I don't know what what generative AI would do, if they're going to be injecting, let's say, disclaimer phrases that some claim that, women will kind of preface what they say to soften what they're about to say. So I don't know if generative AI would actually do those things, like actually generate content. But I think it's a really interesting question. Yes.
Hi. You mentioned individuals or corporations using visual AI to display diversity. How do you think this could possibly affect other disciplines such as business, finance, or healthcare?
Wow, I don't. I don't know. I mean, I think that's the worry. There's this existential worry that there's hearings in Congress. We have a great presidential symposium coming up at Hofstra that's going to be talking about all those things that you're saying, business, healthcare, law, and please pick up a flyer for this artificial intelligence, in education. I think for me, and I said this earlier in the radio show, I think what's going to happen is that AI is going to be just kind of merged and blended into a lot of our traditional tools. So we're not going to be saying, okay, I'm going to do it this way, and then I'm going to turn and I'm going to try the AI tools. It's going to be mixed up. And so there's going to be a huge gray area. And already, I think, when we look at Microsoft Word, when I insert an image into Microsoft Word, you'll see an automatic caption that's written by AI, and it describes the image. And those are like the alt text for people with reading disabilities, sight disabilities, so they can read what it's there. And so already, the AI technology is just being infused in everything we do. So, when we write something, it's going to auto-correct it. So we have the right spelling. Well, what's next? It's going to start suggesting next words, which we already know it does. It might suggest new paragraphs, new ideas. So, where does it end? And we kind of have to decide, am I in control? How much of this is AI and how much is not? And I think that's the question.
I had a question because of something that I've heard, and I haven't studied this myself, so I don't know, but I have heard that the visual design of anime characters is based on the face of a cat, right? And so I'm wondering how that might fit in with depersonalization, because you mentioned how, you know, depersonalization is all about taking the person out of the thing, and so I'm wondering if that might be a factor in why, because anime is of course a Japanese invention, that might affect the racial output of AI somehow.
Yeah, I mean, I've seen that as well. But I don't know if it's actually, whether it's actually a Western person saying, hey, look, these anime characters look like cats. So that must have been the intention. Or if it's like somebody who is Japanese and, you know, knows the history and the culture of anime saying, yeah, we purposely, not purposely, but we kind of like cats. Cats are super cute. And so we want to have our characters look like super cute cats. So I don't know, you know, where that assertion comes from.
Oh, that's loud. So I had another thing to say, but I also wanted to respond to like the cat thing. That Japanese beauty standards are largely based on cuteness, so I could see where that inference is like coming from. Oh my god. But I'd also like to mention that the occurrence or trends that you see in like typical anime art styles, which include like big eyes and like a non-existent nose and like unrealistic proportions, it's very much intentional, and it's actually called mukokuseki, which means it's a stateless art style. So it has no ties to race or the portrayal of race, because Japan is a very homogenous and ethnically homogenous society. So when you see anime characters with multicolored hair and like unnatural colored eyes, it's kind of in response to the majority Japanese population that has black hair, pale skin, or like a smaller range of skin color and like brown eyes. They want to make their character designs more interesting, but that's also not to say that they don't racialize other races, especially other Asian races, because if you see in like older anime and maybe like even newer anime, the Japanese protagonists will be drawn or portrayed in like this cute, heroic art style, but then the enemies, who are typically of another race, like say maybe black people or Chinese coded characters, they're drawn with different features that caricaturize them.
Right.
So just because an art style is like stateless doesn't mean that you can't other races and other people in that art style.
Yes.
And there's also the difference between like Western art and Asian and like Eastern art, because I think the West is particularly very good at racializing people and portraying their features almost to a fault. But because I think a lot of people who consume Eastern media who are not from the East will portray their perceptions based on their consumption of Western media. And in Western media, they see that the white characters are drawn in like a very standardized way, but when there's an Asian or a black character, you'll know that they're Asian or black because their features will almost be drawn in like a completely different style. So when they see an anime art style, which the main characters are all Asian, they'll be like, they don't look Asian. That doesn't fit my definition of what an Asian person looks like.
Right.
So
yeah.
I just thought that it was really interesting that you brought that up.
Right. Yeah. And I mean, I think what you're saying is totally on track, because, you know, we need those, you know, whether we live here or we live in a different society, we need, you know, markers to say, oh, that's not us. That's, you know, party X. Or if I do it this way, that's party Y. What I think is interesting for generative AI is, I don't know, maybe this is a big generalization, but I think in the West, there's more of a priority for photorealism, you know, something that's naturalistic, mimetic of our real world. But then now we're getting this anime style, and you're kind of making it realistic. So we have like a realistic looking person who also looks like a cartoon. So it's a very interesting aesthetic.
Hi. So I was looking into AI art and how, like, if you put in like male superhero, let's say, and then female superhero, how it'll be represented in very different ways. Where like the female one will be more sexualized or be more like improbable, where and then a male one will be like more practical and more heroic and like less submissive. And I was wondering, not only like how does that like what does that reveal about the like male gaze and like how people sexualize femininity, but also how men like to see themselves represented.
Yeah, I mean, I think that it's entirely indicative of you know, these embedded stereotypes. They are those stereotypes are embedded in the algorithm, in the machine learning. And if you wanted to have a female superhero, not in a submissive pose or not in like a skimpy outfit, you actually explicitly have to say, you know, to do something else, right? So the norm, the default rendering is, you know, has all those gender display cues. The default rendering has that. And so that's, it's not in just in generative AI, but that's in all our disciplines, you know, that we resort to the default. And we have to explicitly say that it's not, you know, that stereotype. I mean, we deal with that in journalism a lot, you know, about the, my class knows this, but the neutral reader is not really a neutral reader. Anyone else? Okay. Well, you know what? Actually, let's see. If you don't mind, I would like to take a selfie. I don't want to generate it. Yeah, for AI. That's a big joke, right? Okay, good. All right. Thank you so much. And don't forget, you know, there's a very important presidential symposium. Thank you for coming. And don't forget, you know, there's a very important presidential symposium that has lectures and forums on AI and its effect and impact on all your disciplines. So please take a look at it.